Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. T. Sai Chandramouli, former Associate Professor of English, Railway College, Osmania University, Hyderabad. In this module, in paper 4, we discuss social, political, economical and cultural background of 20th century England with special reference to interwars, war and post-war period. English society and culture between the wars 1919 and 1939 deserve special mention. The wars, especially the First World War, battered, bruised and hurt the pride of England as a leading nation in the world. It was said that the sun never set in the British Empire, but the reputation took a severe beating on account of the First World War and Second World War. America emerged as a superpower slowly and steadily. In the same manner, the decline of England and her glory also was slow and steady. The interwar years was a period of sorrow, hopelessness, pain, agony, and anguish for the people. The Great Depression during 1929 to 30, on account of the collapse of Wall Street and also speculation, resulted in a great economic misery, financial loss, and loss of glory also for England. And people began to look at capitalism with more skepticism than at the time of Marx. I quote, "Traditional perceptions of home, village, and town boundaries were broken. Ideas of communication between people were altered." Unquote, Clapson. Britain, like other European countries, experienced unimaginable social change. Traditional Victorian morals and bourgeois culture fell by the wayside, even as the avant-gardists tried to develop a new aesthetic that could adequately represent the confusion and chaos of modernity. The sudden growth of cinema audience necessitated an increase in places that seasoned screened films. This indicates a shift in the preference of people as far as spending their leisure time is concerned. I quote, "Culminating in the great picture palaces of 1920s, which rivaled theaters and opera houses for opulence and splendor," unquote, Smith. Feels that people's tastes have undergone a total change. They looked for comfort and spending time more in leisurely activities. Though the British and Germans did play a role in spreading culture of cinema, it was the French, followed by the Americans, who began to dominate world cinema. The British government, however, responded with a cultural policy, introducing cinematographic acts of 1928. The radio grew simultaneously as a form of entertainment, education, and also for spending time at home. Arthur Burroughs read a news bulletin that included a report of train robbery, an important political meeting, some sport results, and weather forecasts, making news hour more interesting, demanding, and compelling to the British audience. Dog racing, along with other forms of gambling like football pools and Irish hospital sweepstakes, a sort of lottery permitted by the Irish Free State in 1930 to raise funds for an Irish hospital, continued as alternative forms of entertainment in England. Yet the government tried to restrict access to betting and gambling between the wars. The general strike of 1926 requires a little attention. The speculative boom created in 1919 to 20 of post-war British economy collapsed like a pack of cards in the year 1921. Problems in staple industries persisted with high levels of unemployment, poor labor management. The impact of war could be seen in the export price of coal slumping, and industry was in doldrums. Government and mine owners sought to restore profitability by imposing wage cuts. Trade union movements before the war had begun to make alliances across industrial sectors, and growing disturbance, growing unemployment, and growing poverty contributed to the organizing times. The trade unions called a lockout on 3rd May. This time the Triple Alliance stood firm, and the first line of transport workers and railwaymen came out with miners involving just under 2 million workers. A major labor unrest was slowly, steadily, but powerfully unfolding. With the Great Depression in 1929, unemployment rose from 1 million to over 3 million in England alone, according to Clapson. Although many industrial regions were affected by high unemployment, the northwest of England, certain Scotland, central Scotland, and South Wales were the worst affected. These were designated as distress areas. And they were also targeted for assistance by the Special Areas Act of the year 1934. Migration from these areas into wealthier regions reflected the social geography of economic change. To reconstruct the past was the slogan taken up so that British economy can be revived. The only one who was able to comprehend the economic mess was John Maynard Keynes, who studied the situation and took pains to explain to politicians and people the fact that the economy has changed. The traditional premises were no longer valid, and it was necessary to invent a new economy theory, he stated. He put forth his thesis in his magnum opus of the 20th century economic theory titled The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in the year 1936. Beginnings of modernity in art and literature. Charles Baudelaire, a pioneer of modernism, captured its essence thus in The Painter of Modern Life. I quote, "Modernity is the transient, the fleeting, the contingent. It is one half of art, the other being the eternal and the immovable." Unquote. From this quote, and many similar statements made by artists and writers on modernity, it is amply clear that modernity is an obsession with the time. Modernist writers and artists try to represent anxiety of the fleeting times, and obsession with the time also was spectacular during that period. The technology of war has established the terms of mass society differently. Society merely for individual atoms absorbed within the surge and swarm of groups. Modernity, therefore, can be best understood only as a series of distinctures and discontinuities with the past. It cannot be seen entirely as a 20th century phenomenon alone. Let me quote, "Rupture and transition that had accompanied modernity since at least the beginning of the 19th century." Unquote. Let us take a look at modern fiction. Novelists who played a leading role in establishing the modernist literary canon of 1920s were born within relatively few years of one another. Wonderful. So wonderful indeed. Max Ford was born in 1873. Dorothy Richardson was born in 1873, while E.M. Forster made his entry in the year 1879. James Joyce was born in 1882. Wyndham Lewis was born in 1882. Virginia Woolf opened her eyes in the year 1882, and D.H. Lawrence made his entry in the year 1885. Thus, within a short period, one after the other, a succession of brilliant writers have entered the scene in England. Very, very rare phenomenon indeed anywhere in the world literary scenario. Levinson suggests that in the case of these modernists, a collective consciousness of maturing as artists accompanies a memory of having been young together in the uncertain pre-war period. Perhaps it's a sort of binding force. He says it's a sort of element that brings these people together since they share sympathies and views and pains alike. Now, modern poetry is contributed by Walter Pater, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot. These are the leading lights of the day who made the poetic scenario dazzling, brilliant, and tantalizing. Neil Roberts suggests that modernist poets to a large extent have defined the terms in which the criticism of poetry has been conducted. He rightly points out that the century should be seen as one in which poetry has been overwhelmingly self-conscious and self-reflexive. Most of the modernist poets took their cue from the French symbolist artists and gathered momentum in their movements. They wrote manifestos and largely created cultural environment in which their work was received. One may be surprised when Roberts argues that influence of poets like Pound and Eliot was disproportionate to their number or to the sales of their books. A very strange logic, a very strange statement indeed. Hence, he gives importance to other smaller groups of poets such as Black Mountain and language poets, who formed conscious alliances and articulated shared principles. The century saw poets divided between two groups. One of the academics who taught in classrooms even and then foraged into the arena of poetry, and those who were totally dedicated to the art of composing poetry, creating literary awareness through their poems. We may mention William Carlos Williams as the person who condemned Eliot for handing poetry to academics. He found fault with Eliot for allowing academics enter poetic arena. Nevertheless, one can suggest that modern poets tried their best to represent what Thomas Carlyle says in his essay Signs of the Times, which was published in the year 1829. When we take a look at the British culture and society during the period 1939 to 1945, we may notice that nationalism, propaganda, and rise of the welfare state were the major issues or the concerns of the people as well as the state. Clapson agrees with George Orwell, who argues that war would have little impact or effect on national identity and would remain anchored around the same pre-war issues of class, regionalism, and host of stereotypes. George Orwell's contribution to British literature and fiction is immense. Its impact is far-reaching. George Orwell's real name was Eric Blair, and he was born in Bihar, in India. His love for India and his eagerness to forge strong bonds between the ruler and the subject is very, very significant. It assumes greater significance during the time when Raj fiction demanded perpetuation of the colonial rule in all the colonies, more so in India. George Orwell was a talks producer in the Eastern Service. He was concerned with creating two celebrated books written under the pen name of Georgeville subsequently. He used his experience there to create the deliberately confusing language of news that he called newspeak in the novel 1984. The novel 1984 creates a situation where a dictatorial or authoritarian situation prevails, as was witnessed in the later part of 20th century. George Orwell, in that sense, can be called a visionary with a foresight to look into the possibilities taking place a few decades ahead of his times. In the first 2 years of war, the country seemed perched on the edge of imminent defeat at the hands of Nazi Germany, and in 1940, a German invasion of Britain looked quite possible and imminent. The pessimistic Home Morale Emergency Committee of the Ministry of Information prepared and circulated throughout the country a pamphlet called "If the Invader Comes." Such was the fear, such was the terror created by the Germans and the Nazi army on the British psyche. However, national confidence increased after the end of the Blitz, but hit a new low when Japan invaded Singapore in 1941-42. The tide turned in England's favor again in 42, when news came of Hitler's forces being defeated at both El Alamein and Stalingrad. The report led to the establishment of a social security system and national health service after the end of the war. Let's now look at the role of women during the war, how they came out of the home and took part in the war, standing side by side with men and assisting them, aiding them, and sharing their responsibilities during the war in various fields. Claims made by feminists that war was a liberating force for women who were earlier denied opportunities to work alongside the men are indeed facts established by war. War served as an incentive in national recruitment campaigns to encourage women to join forces or volunteers for civilian war work. Wartime feminists were anxious to see women's potential displayed fully, splendidly, as it ought to be, as war workers being properly utilized and importantly properly rated. So they were not satisfied with the opportunities provided, but they wanted to establish their potential. They wanted to display and establish their capabilities during the wartime. Dorothy Sheridan suggests that for women of the day, wartime images that appeared in popular magazines like Picture Post hold a popular appeal. Photos of little girls driving tractors and women driving buses, ambulances, and military trucks inspired many a woman and a girl to come out and take up some responsibility or the other, some duty or the other, some profession or the other. Their participation, sharing responsibilities, displaying their caliber and capabilities emboldened women, and they felt that they were no longer fettered to home and hearth permanently. Dorothy Sheridan avers that such a view of war as a liberating influence cannot be substantiated, since it is rather vague about what the gains of war were actually. Her skepticism need not disappoint anybody. A second view that runs contrary to the one mentioned earlier suggests that although women were temporarily able to escape from the strictly gender-defined roles, they were forced back into the home as soon as the war ended. Male chauvinism at play brilliantly again. So man remains man wherever he is. Whenever he wants to control a woman, he shows the hearth and confines her to the home at the slightest opportunity. Feminists studying the impact of war on women had to walk the tightrope to find a balance between the two opposing views shared now or discussed now. The post-war scene saw winds of cultural change. The post-war period is generally seen as a time of historical change, a period that ushered in hope and stability, and the time that saw rising standards of living, rising rates of literacy, and guarantee of education, at least until the age of 15. Historically speaking, the war has boosted capitalism, capitalist forays, and thought process all over the world. Many historians feel that capitalism finally hits its stride because of the war. War created an impression that capitalism, with its inherent contradiction of competitive accumulation and expansionism, cannot secure steady progress for humanity. Moreover, Soviet style of socialism was always glaring the Western world in the eyes, creating a heightened sense of insecurity, which slowly slipped into Cold War in the next few decades. After the war, however, it appeared as if the promise of steady progress towards a more prosperous, more secure, and from the mid-19th century onwards, we may say, a fairer society was slowly evolving. Europe seemed to be on the threshold of a new phase in history, having faced brutal inter-capitalist wars, revolutions, and murderous counter-revolutions that had destroyed its self-image of a progressive civilization. After 1945, Keynesian economic policies used state expenditure to avoid dramatic economic crisis. Welfare state doled out a panoply of new benefits. England could successfully keep the lid on class conflict after the war. Democratization of progress was made possible by the advent of mass media, especially television and recorded music, so that more and more people could take part in that, more and more people could be involved, and it is no longer the prerogative of a privileged few only, as it was in the earlier period. Education also played a major role in bringing about a change in the society by breaking the old stereotypes of class in England. A new middle class emerged, which consisted of managers, new-style professionals, welfare state employees, who were totally dependent on formal education. And the older middle-class occupations that were more skill-oriented no longer mattered much. It was also the time when the tendency to get educated became stronger in British society, more so among the middle-class masses. To the institutions or universities as a compulsion, the new middle class made education their social capital by tying it up with the prestige and status. They found an elevated stature in the society on account of their academic accomplishments. The post-war period threw up some significant cultural initiatives, such as the creation of the Arts Council, the 1951 Festival of Britain, the expansion and transformation of BBC's provision, and inauguration of independent television. The most significant one among these was the Education Act of 1944, which guaranteed free education until the age of 15. The Act also brought the previously independent religious and grammar schools into state system. A sort of uniformity and democratic means of imparting and sharing information with the masses was on the upsurge and welcomed by the people wholeheartedly. Promoting cultures, building identities marked the period 1945 to 70. The era also witnessed growing regionalism, ethnicity, and race factors becoming new categories of identity that posed a challenge to the monolithic idea of a nation, promoted earlier and sustained carefully and perpetuated by the British Empire. Scottish, Irish, Welsh identities were now yearning for cultural distinction of their own in literature as well as in speech and in writing. Television's growing status as a mass medium developed throughout these years was sustained because of popular demand, interest, acceptance. The decline of the cinema remained a central part of cultural consciousness and experience for much of the 1950s. People were wondering why cinemas are no longer appealing or alluring as it was earlier. By 1955, a situation has come where it was decided that commercial television had to be supervised by an independent television authority in England known as ITA. The Resurgent 60s introduced Britain's longest running and most successful soap opera, Coronation Street, in 1960. Although censorship of literature and arts was relaxed during the 50s, it became even more during the 60s. For example, the F word was first used on television during the decade. 60s decade was also accompanied by great humanitarian strides in social policy. Homosexuality was decriminalized. Abortion became legally available. Access to contraception was made easier. Divorce was more accessible, affordable, and became more honorable. Such far-reaching social changes indicate the waning influence of Victorian values. It proved to be good for England and world itself. Rise of pop culture in subsequent period involved youth to a larger extent. It has drawn them in droves. Cultural relationship between youth, music, and attendant forms of visual style was very much on the rise and very conspicuous. Even before the war, they were there, but post-war has thrown the doors open to the upsurge or the flood. Freed from earlier notions of a shared culture or a common culture, popular culture began to emerge and circulate as a distinctive marker of class in the socio-economic milieu of post-war industrial capitalism. The popularity of Beatles, who broke onto the scene with a startling impact, established impact of American pop music in England or in London. A year later, in January 1964, as millions watched the Beatles on the CBS, the Sullivan Show Rock and Roll ceased to be exclusive American art form. The British pop music industry actively sought American discs for indigenous artists to imitate. African American performance prominently figured and took to all parts of the globe the charm and beauty of American music and their own creative power. The preference of white British audiences for performances who looked like them added a racist angle to their thinking and preference. Postmodern Britain from 1970 to the end of the century displays desperately painfully the decline of England in different ways, in different arenas. Perhaps this was on account of decolonization. Perhaps this was the impact of post-colonial context, post-colonial situation. Perhaps this was on account of various countries which got liberation and independence from their colonial rulers and European masters. Thus, major African, Asian countries have become independent and started creating ripples of their own cultural contribution. Closer home, Northern Ireland remained a festering wound in the English body politic. The violent Irish conflict for constitutional status called the Troubles began with a civil rights march in Londonderry on 5th October 1968. Britain has become a home for many people with diverse backgrounds. It has become ethnically diverse. Perhaps Britain is the first country which has proclaimed itself to be a multicultural nation, multicultural society. Indian, Pakistan, and Bangladeshi restaurants added spice to much maligned British cuisine. Multiculturalism became the order of the day, though it was not easy for the native majority to accept some cultural practices of minority immigrant groups. But changing times and demand of the moment made the English government or the British government accept the reality and reconcile themselves to the changing times and transform their preferences, transform themselves in order to go ahead in the modern world. Employment opportunities for women increased considerably, even though the wars triggered or gave the impotence long ago, a few decades ago. The Equal Pay legislation of 1971 is a significant landmark. Concerns regarding sexuality, sexual preferences also figured prominently during this time, during this period. Sexual relationships became much freer with rising number of gay and lesbian relationships. Families grew smaller. Nuclear families became order of the day. And it was no longer stigmatic to have children outside of marriage or to live as an unmarried couple. Divorce Act of 1969 had also contributed to the growth of a number of smaller households, we may call nuclear families. Towards the end of the century, the last lingering traces of Victorian prudery and censoriousness were wiped out totally, absolutely, by the introduction of the liberalized opening hours of pubs and bars, and by the introduction of 1994 of the national lottery system in England. In the sphere of culture, England followed the American way by adopting consumerism as a way of life. The state now actively sought to promote profit from what it once tried to prohibit. To sum up, in this module we have discussed various factors that were noticed in England during this period. 40s and 50s threw open doors to modern art, modern poetry, modernist approach in literary and artistic pursuits. Subsequently, after the war, after the Great Depression, after the collapse of Wall Street and consumerism has entered, capitalist forays could not be resisted, and England was slowly turning itself into a multicultural society by inviting, accepting, absorbing people with diverse backgrounds. Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis established restaurants on a large scale which could rival and outtaste the traditional British cuisine, and also shut the doors of shops that sold American recipes and American food. England was, or rather, is the first country to proclaim itself to be a multicultural country in order to sustain itself as a superpower, though not really a superpower in the changed context. By the end of the century, though the country hasn't got much of financial or political power, on account of its ability to adjust, on account of its ability to accept, on account of its ability to transform itself into a tolerable society, it's able to sustain itself, and it's making a bold movement into the next century with bolstered confidence and morale. Thank you very much.